Okay, well, hi everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining our side event here at COSP 15, Climate and Crisis, Disability, Inclusive Resilience in Cities. I'll do the proper introductions and welcome in a moment, but first things first, I'd like to just run through some housekeeping. So if we can do that first, that would be great. So just to make everyone who has joined us today aware, we do have captioning available. So if you require captions, then please just push the closed caption button to access the closed captions. We also have international sign language available. So if you require international sign language, that is available and is on the screen. We welcome questions from you, the audience, throughout this session. So if you do have any questions you'd like to put to us in the panel, then please do type those into the Q&A box as we go, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we possibly can during the session. If we have to pick up some afterwards, then that's okay too. Making everyone also aware that today's event will be recorded. And also just to say that the chat functionality will be turned off for screen reader purposes. So that's the housekeeping. Hopefully that's all clear to all of you. And once again, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our side event at this 15th session of the Conference of States Parties to the CRPD. Many of you will be aware that the sub-theme 3 of this year's conference is participation of persons with disabilities in climate action, disaster risk reduction, and resilience against natural disasters. It was this sub-theme that inspired our side event, which is titled Climate and Crisis, Disability Inclusive Resilience in Cities, hosted by the Global Disability Innovation Hub, with an amazing expert panel who we will meet shortly to discuss this very important topic. My name is Ian McKinnon, and I am one of the co-founders and directors of the Global Disability Innovation Hub, and I lead our work on inclusive design, principally that of the built environment, with an increasing focus on cities in developing countries. Working across Asia and the Pacific region and across Africa, we're seeing just how interconnected climate resilience is to inclusion in our cities. We know that low and middle income cities are often most at risk to changes in our climate. And we also know that measures to protect infrastructure from these changes can so often make urban areas less inclusive. Evidence has also shown that persons with disabilities are more at risk to climate change and other crises. So we're really pleased to see this subject have prominence as a sub-theme at COSP this year. Rapidly changing environments and informal settlements in cities require inclusive solutions that bridge innovative thinking across humanitarian responses and sustainable urban development. This is essential for long-term resilience, and today's session will demonstrate how inclusive design and planning approaches co-designed with persons with disabilities can deliver on these solutions. We will hear from our panel experts, learning from their latest research, programs, and advocacy, demonstrating the opportunities for and some of the methods used to integrate disability-inclusive urban development with sustainability and resilience to support implementation of the CRPD. We hope in doing so that we can identify some regional priorities and global opportunities for disability-inclusive resilient cities, both now and into the future. So having set the scene, let me quickly introduce our panel before we hear from them directly. So today we have Michaela Patrick, Senior Inclusive Design Researcher at the Global Disability Innovation Hub. We have Hannes Yulin Lagrulis from World Blind Union. We have Utsav Chowdhury and Kanika Bansal from India's National Institute of Urban Affairs. And we have Raitimetse Nthanko and Valentina Reverso from RISE, Relationships Inspiring Social Enterprise. So now each of our panelists will take a couple of minutes to introduce themselves and their work, and also say why they're passionate about this subject, before we're then going to move into the Q&A session and discussion, which is the main focus of the day. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions as we go, please pop them into the Q&A box and we'll try our best to pick them up as we go. So with that, I'd like to hand over to quickly introduce herself, her work, and also her passion for the subject to Michaela. Michaela Patrick, over to you.
Right, hello everybody. My name is Michaela Patrick, and as Ian said, I am a senior researcher at the Global Disability Innovation Hub, and I work across the areas of inclusive design and climate resilience. So today I wanted to talk to you about one of our major programs of work at GDI Hub, which is called 80-20-30. 80-20-30 is a multi-year £20 million UK aid-funded program which is looking at what works to improve access to life-changing assistive technology for all. Under this program, we've also been looking at the built environment, cities, and infrastructure, because we found that AT access also needs an enabling environment to support people's participation and enjoyment in daily life. This work, which is called 80-20-30 Inclusive Infrastructure, aims to provide evidence and actions to support creating more inclusive cities. We're conducting research case studies in different cities around the world, including Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, Varanasi in India, Solo in Indonesia, Nairobi in Kenya, and Freetown in Sierra Leone. And here we're looking to understand the current challenges and opportunities for implementing inclusive design in cities. We work closely with local disabled persons organizations, NGOs, research institutions, and other partners to deliver inclusive and participatory research. And I'm really delighted to say that some of our partners are actually joining us in this session today. So one of our major findings so far, when looking at what works to create inclusive cities, what we found is that we can't afford to think about inclusion without considering resilience and sustainability. And the reverse is also true, that we can't think about resilience and sustainability without including inclusion. Why is that? Well, there's lots of reasons, and they're both complex cross-cutting issues, but we're thinking about it in particular from two angles. So firstly, we know that persons with disabilities are most affected by crises and climate change. And we also know that this is likely to worsen as the climate crisis increases in intensity. With 80% of persons with disabilities living in more climate vulnerable countries, we have to make sure that persons with disabilities are not left behind when it comes to a climate resilient future for our planet. We've seen and heard it from our participants and local partners in these cities. Climate has a huge impact on accessibility for all. Secondly, it's also clear that huge proportions of investments in infrastructure in the coming years are going to be directed at climate solutions, whether that's for adaptation, mitigation, resilience, or emergency responses. And these solutions really need to be inclusive. Why is that? Well, first and foremost, it's a human rights issue. But secondly, it's also the most sustainable thing to do. Evidence shows that retrofitting designs at a later date is significantly more expensive. And that's without even considering the associated carbon costs for our planet of rebuilding and adapting buildings at a later date. So let's build things that work for everyone right the first time round. It's the equitable and resourceful solution for both people and planet. So just to end, I thought I'd quickly touch on how do we deliver inclusive and climate resilient cities. Well, it's not easy, but we're starting to learn what works. Our evidence is showing things like the fact that we need to break down silos across government departments, that cities need inclusive design strategies, and they need concrete policies such as inclusive design standards to drive implementation. Our work is really aiming to provide relevant evidence, recommendations, and actions that can support cities in this work. Hopefully we'll be able to discuss more details about some of the why and the how throughout this session. But I wanted to end by letting you know that we're really excited that at the World Urban Forum in a couple of weeks in Poland, we're going to be launching our inclusive design strategy. So make sure you follow GDI Hub to stay in the loop on updates on this, and there we'll be able to tell you a lot more about how inclusive design works and what it can do. Thanks very much, and back to Ian.
Thank you, Michaela. Excellent. And now, Hannes, if I can come to you, if you could please introduce yourself and your work and let us know why you're so passionate about this area. Hannes, over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ian. So very quickly, my name is Hannes Zililagilis, and I come from the World Blind Union. I'm leading our global program for inclusive and accessible urban development. And I've been engaged in the disability rights movement myself, with the lived experience of visual impairment since, and I've been engaged in the movement for over 10 years. But for the last 4 years, I've been focusing my efforts on urban development. And I see that urbanization is going to happen whether we like it or not, and it's happening fast. We see that the urban trend now is, and it's projected that over 70% of the world's population will live in cities in the coming decades. And it's natural, and that includes over 2 billion persons with disabilities and older persons. Over 90% of the urban growth we're yet to see is going to happen in low-income countries, as stressed by Michaela previously, primarily in East and South Asia and Africa, where the risk for climate change is higher, where cities face increasing risks and exposure to hazards and disasters, putting persons with disability at risk of the adverse impacts of climate change, including threats to their health, food security, water, sanitation, and livelihoods. Coupled with this trend is the estimation that around 30 million persons with disabilities are expected to be displaced due to climate events, where they primarily will seek refuge in cities and also move between cities. As populations rapidly grow, it is essential for urban policies, strategies, plans, and practices to respond to the rights and needs of all persons with disabilities in order to address risks, prevent rising inequalities, and ensure that the obligations set by the CRPD are met. Cities and local governments are truly epicenters to respond to today's challenges that impact persons with disabilities, where they're often most impacted by climate change, poverty, and exclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic, as we have experienced, and humanitarian emergencies. Decision, choices, and practices directly influence the extent we as persons with disabilities can lead independent lives before, during, and after crises. However, although cities are at the forefront, they are still struggling to be viewed as key drivers for development, not only problems. A key issue is that persons with disabilities are often excluded from national and local policies, practices, decision-making, and that the organization of persons with disabilities are recognized as key development stakeholders. This leads, in my experience, to the risk that cities and local governments adopt practices that, instead of bridging divides, exacerbate barriers, and adopt practices which will simply not work for everyone. Following this, my work at the World Blind Union is focusing on bridging these gaps towards ensuring that our members and organization of persons with disabilities we are partnering with are working collectively with global stakeholders and national and local governments. Our work at the World Blind Union, which I'm currently heading, springs from the New Urban Agenda. The New Urban Agenda is truly a roadmap to localize and realize the obligations in the CRPD, other development and humanitarian agendas, by promoting inclusive and sustainable urban policies, services, infrastructure, and products that help make the rights real at community levels where we live. Exclusion of persons with disabilities and other marginalized groups from urban governance and processes at all levels is an issue because cities, towns, and villages shape practically every aspect of our life today. The global program we are implementing at the World Blind Union seeks to ensure that our membership and partnering OPDs are effectively influencing the implementation of this new urban agenda, including programs, policies, and legal frameworks to ensure disability inclusion and accessibility for all persons with disabilities in line with the CRPD. It contains activities and initiatives related to advocacy, where we support coordination and capacity building of members and OPD partners to take meaningful part in relevant processes, forums, and discussions guiding urban development at global level, and to have the space to also share and support mainstream stakeholders with technical expertise as experts in their own rights and based on their lived experiences. Our program also contains capacity building efforts where we develop and share tools and resources to help both mainstream stakeholders and OPDs to deliver such technical expertise on accessibility, on standards and universal design. Lastly, our third program component relates to networking and partnerships, which includes strengthening our engagement together with mainstream stakeholders, including, for example, the United Nations Human Settlements Program and the United Cities and Local Governments, the global organization comprised of municipalities and local governments all around the world, where we as an OPD are seen as a true stakeholder, a true partner in multi-stakeholder partnerships, so that we have a role in supporting initiatives moving further to ensure CRPD compliance, accessibility, and also leverage the comparative advantage we have as different types of organization towards more inclusive, resilient cities for everyone. Yes. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks. Thank you, Hannes. That was great. Lovely introduction. Thank you so much. Excellent. Now I'd like to go across to Utsav and Kanika. If you could both introduce yourselves and your passion for this subject, and then tell us a bit more about the work of NIUA, that would be fantastic. So Utsav and Kanika, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Namaste from India. My name is Utsav Chaudhary, and I'm joined by my fellow colleague, Kanika Bansal. We both represent an organization called the National Institute of Urban Affairs. We are based out of New Delhi in India. And the program that I'm representing along with my colleague goes by the name of Building Accessible, Safe, Inclusive Indian Cities. In short, BASIC. While it might be basic in the way we have named it, the work that we are doing is quite important in the context of India. What I would like to emphasize on is the fact that India is a country that requires a number of interventions across different sectors and in different ways to promote inclusion. And that was some of the founding principles and questions that we had around how do we make the cities and urbanization process more inclusive. Now, India is home to roughly 30 million persons with disability, and this is going back a decade. We don't have very recent data on the persons with disability in the country, and we only estimate it's going to go up. So that makes it further more important that with the rising aspirations and the rising demographic dividend, we need to ensure that the cities are able to provide for persons with disability in a fair and equitable manner. Now, with that in mind, the question that we had was, what kind of policies do you really need? What kind of interventions do you need to plan? What kind of monitoring and evaluation frameworks do you need to put together? And what kind of initiatives and city level interventions that can we plan at scale for disability inclusion to be the norm at a national, state, and city level? With those questions, we started our work and we started our partnership with the Varanasi Smart City Limited, which is VSCL and is based out of Varanasi. And our work with our partners, including GDI Hub, is something that I'm going to be emphasizing on. Our work with Varanasi was mostly to understand where they are currently in terms of their limitations of applying the principles of universal design, but to also understand what kind of policy frameworks would they need to make it work. And that kind of intervention, along with the co-designing process that we involved with GDI Hub and with the local partners, we kind of saw the change over a period of time. The program has been working with Varanasi for about 3 years. And I'm very proud to say that in the 3 years that we have worked with Varanasi, they have invested roughly 200 crores or more in creating infrastructures, which is schools and recreational spaces, parks, and quite a number of interventions across the board to promote disability inclusion and inclusion at large. And we want to replicate a similar blueprint in other cities to make disability inclusion much, much more easier. Now, for that to happen, what we have also done is that we have tried to meet halfway with what the national policies are and what the practitioners and what other agencies ought to do. With that in mind, what we did was that we worked with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, which is the central ministry for developing cities and the built environment. And we looked at the standards and guidelines that need to be looked at. we recently were able to revise some of the most critical guidelines that are important for cities to follow. They are called the Harmonized Guidelines and Space Standards. And we have also supported our town and country planning office in our country to revise the urban development guidelines that the urban planners follow. With that in mind, I think what I would like to emphasize on the work that we are doing is to essentially prime the ecosystem to allow an exchange of ideas and allow the exchange of interventions to happen at scale so that we can proliferate the concept of universal design and inclusion across India and make it one of the most inclusive cities in the world. Kanika, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Utsav. So Utsav has very well captured the entire essence of our work. I would like to contribute onto the topic and the work we are doing for this particular topic. So, I would like to start with a quote which Sir Simon Coffey, the Taboo foreign minister, said in the COP26. He said that we don't need any more scientific evidence of the dreadful consequences of climate change. The world is experiencing it. Not only it's happening, but it's speeding up. And that's what we are also facing, that India is experiencing one of the most...
I'm sorry, it's the interpreter here. Can you please slow down? Everyone's speaking too fast. Sorry.
No problem. Yeah, I will repeat myself. So I would like to I would like to start with the quote of Simon Coffey, who in the COP26 said that we don't need any more scientific evidence of the dreadful consequences of climate change. The world is experiencing it. Not only it's happening, but it is speeding up. And that's exactly what we are facing in India today. We are having one of the most harshest hot wave, and this year itself we have seen the most harshest cold wave. So it's very safe to say that climate change is a globally accepted reality, and it is not only having inconceivable impacts, but it's like the impact is also unpredictable. So according to the IPCC sixth assessment report, approximately 3.3 to 3.6 billion people are living in highly vulnerable places to climate change. And even the Sustainable Goal 11 and 13 promote the visions of making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable for climate change and other disasters which are predicted to happen due to climate change. So along with these, we have already in place strategies like the Vivaco Millennium Framework for Action, Vivaco +5 towards an inclusive, barrier-free and right-based society. And even in the United Nations Convention for Right of Persons with Disability Act, the United Nations Convention of Rights of Persons with Disability has been reiterated. It has been reiterated that inclusion of persons with disability should be made in all disaster and emergency response system, which becomes even more prevalent in the case of climate change. So we will need to have responses. We'll need to have policies which are more responsive. The climate policies itself is like reiterating equity and human rights. So the entire basis of climate policy is on equity and human rights. And then we are talking about persons with disability. It becomes even more important to include them, because as Michaela already has pointed out, it's not only making inclusive, but also investing in the right direction. So I would like to point out towards one of the study which under the basic program we have taken up, which has highlighted that climate induced disasters are likely to have more impact on persons with disability among the other vulnerable groups, and we need to have an intervention, like a 7-step intervention, to actually include them into the policy making system itself. Also universal accessibility, which is likely to be, we are expecting, we are hopeful that it will be promoted after the introduction of the harmonized guidelines and standards for universal accessibility in India, will bring in a drastic change, and it will make universal accessibility embedded into the very making of urban infrastructure and systems. Also, also the inclusive city framework which we have developed will give the city a roadmap. It will also help them assess on the inclusive provisions which they have provided at a policy level, at a program level, at a project level. So, and also monitoring that change, monitoring that level of inclusion is something which becomes critical. So I would like to end here. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Utsav and Kanika, for that overview of your work and clear passion for the subject. And we're going to come to a question that's going to pick up the role of policies, which is coming through quite strongly in your work, certainly. And we'll pick that up in a moment. And now I'd like to come to Reitumetse and Valentina from RISE. If I could ask you both to also introduce yourselves, say a little bit about your passion for the subject and the work that you're doing at RISE, that would be wonderful. Over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning or good afternoon, depending which part of the world you're watching from. My name is Reitumetse Nthako, as stipulated. I'm with my colleague, Valentina Reverso, and we're from a small not-for-profit, RISE International. We are located in the Southern African region in a landlocked country called Lesotho, and we are a US and Lesotho-based not-for-profit. We are strongly passionate about climate change and inclusive design because this is a sector that is primarily not really focused on in the area. And we've been given the privilege through funding by the British High Commission to actually have workshops and exhibitions bringing awareness around this area. But primarily what we feel most strongly about is how the building and construction practices in the country aren't centered around environmentally friendly impacts. There's a strong building practice of using only concrete, and given the really extreme weather conditions of weather climates in the winter going as cold as -8, we feel this is a sector we would love to make the biggest impact on by introducing through our new team of research and innovation, a new sector of building through indigenous and renewable materials like hemp, as well as compact bricks and rammed earth and adobe brick. Given today about climate and disability and inclusive resilience in cities, given that Maseru has a population of 1 million people, with the country having a total of 2.2 million residents, we hope to see a CBD area where people with disabilities and those who are able-bodied, there is no difference at all. Hence why we're so related around inclusive design. And we do this through our participatory design methodology, which is at the heart of all our projects. How we execute this is it's a design centered around the user as well as people in the community. The result is that you get designs as well as buildings that are focused around what the user needs. I'm not sure if my colleague Valentina wants to add at this point, but thank you from me.
Valentina, do you want to say hi? Or maybe she's dropped off. We'll get her to say hi a little later in the session. Excellent. Well, listen, thank you so much to our panel for that quick kind of introduction to themselves and to their work, which I'm sure we'll agree is really diverse and interesting, but yet all centered on this focal subject that we're talking about today. So I'd like to move into the quick Q&A session and the discussion session, which is really the heart of today's event. And I'm going to start with the first question, which I think, given those introductions, and particularly they're hearing from Utsav and Kanika and the work they're doing in India, I think I'll direct this question to you guys initially, and then perhaps go to Reitumetse, see if she wants to come in and add. So initially, the question we have is, what is the role of policies in addressing climate resilience alongside disability inclusion. So if I can ask Utsav and Kanika to perhaps respond to that initially, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Kanika, do you mind if I take that question?
Sure.
All right, wonderful. Apologies if I was fast before. I was speaking too quickly. I'll slow it down. Ian, what I'll do is I'll break the question into two, if that's fine by you.
Yeah, sure.
All right, thank you. I see there are two aspects to this question. First is generally the role of policy, right? So what does policy do for any city or any country or any state for that matter? And I think the second half of the question is more technical, which is where I'll ask Kanika to chime in. Now, to begin with, in simple words, I think a policy is more like a conduit. It is like a plan of action or maybe even a map that allows cities and administrations to navigate specific situations when they're presented with it. So it's more heuristic in nature. It's not exact by any definition of practice. But by virtue of that, any policy ought to be more universal in its application, meaning that it has to capture more people than not. And most importantly, it has to foster trust among citizens. So if a city and a country is committing to do something in a certain way, then your actions need to follow suit, and that's how you build trust with your citizenry. Principally, I think all policies are instruments to perpetuate inclusion in planning. And that's essentially where we need to start. And I think climate change is not an exception to that rule. If, as a country, we are working towards being resilient, we want to be creating communities that are empowered to handle climate change issues, that we need to ensure that these policies are designed and co-designed inclusively and ensure that persons with disability are onboarded early and are understood in terms of their needs and desires and wants. And we need to essentially move away from this concept of a normative majority, because what's currently happening is most of the policies are essentially fitting in the normative majority as the principal user or the beneficiary of the policies. And we don't necessarily encompass the persons on the fringes, which is probably a person with disability or a woman or a child or an elderly living in a low socioeconomic community. And I think those kind of cognitive biases is something that us as an institution that works on policy making and on delivering interventions to the ground must be able to overcome, and also train those who are working on the ground to battle those challenges more efficiently. I'll take a pause here. Kanika, I'll ask you to chime in to answer the latter half of the question, which is on climate resilience alongside disability inclusion. I mean, how does policy play part into that?
Yeah, thanks, Utsav. So I think you have very well captured the entire essence, and climate policies, as you have also said, climate change policy or the role of policy in climate resilience is actually very similar to disability inclusion. Because in my understanding, and also as what Utsav has also reiterated, has explained is that policy acts as a guide which can be translated into tangible action to address the prevailing inequalities in our urban areas. Like climate change and both climate change and disability inclusion are cross-cutting in nature, and policy acts as a facilitator where we can have integration of different aspects of urban development, be it disability inclusion, be it climate change, be it urban development, be it economic development. All of them actually can be clubbed together, and it can be the interlocking of the various aspects which make a city work can actually happen. So if you may say that it combines the biotic and the abiotic components all together. So whether we are talking about the climate resilience policy or the disability inclusion policy, both of them also focus on the aspects of equity and human rights. And for example, India has a robust set of climate change policies and frameworks, and disability inclusion is something which is it's not addressed in its entirety in all of those policies and framework. And the same thing goes when we are talking about the disability inclusion policy. So we also have like a set of policies and guidelines for disability inclusion, but climate change is something which is not something which is emphasized onto them. So this like the policies can be something which can facilitate this integration of one aspect to the other, and they should be designed in participation becomes another aspect which need to be ensured when we are policies can actually be like an aggregator, when we can actually collect the needs, collect the aspirations, and that could be translated into something which will guide the urban development. So that's something. Also, like climate policies or climate resilience policies, eventually they aim at evenly distributing the environmental cost and benefits across different populations. And they should also, they can also focus on safeguarding the right of vulnerable population, including persons with disabilities. So, we can already see that there has been a growing focus which is getting onto working on how climate change will be impacting onto the various vulnerable groups, but their intersectionality is something which also can actually be captured into those policies. So I think I would like to end here.
Thank you very much, Utsav and Kanika. So really hearing there the importance of policies. Of course, they have an important role to play in the integration of policies. I wonder, Raitumetse and also Valentina, feel free to take this opportunity to introduce yourself. I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about the work you're doing in Lesotho, about the role of policies in addressing climate resilience alongside disability inclusion. Would you like to come in there too?
Yes, thank you very much, Ian. So what we're doing in Lesotho is with policies, as there is a lack of a regulated body that deals with policies around environmental and climate change, we're trying to introduce that structured sense of how to buildings that are regulated, as currently there are no consequences and there is no format that has to be followed by building environment professionals and anyone who's dealing with construction as private entities. And how we've done that is we're trying to have workshops around the country. There's 10 districts in the country. And what we've been able to successfully do is we've had 2 engagements. First, we had an exhibition which had 10 thematic areas, of which inclusive design was the primary core of that exhibition. And we got people to be able to have a distinguish of what are good practices and what are bad practices. This is where we brought attention to that buildings need to have something as simple as a ramp for a wheelchair. It needs to have accessibility from all angles. And this is something people had never had attention drawn to before. And now we're trying to approach it from a regulatory framework a point of view through sitting down with government officials and finding out from them what the current codes are. And surprisingly, they're outdated as far back as over 30 years ago, because the current building codes are from 1984. And when we establish there has to be something done, clearly there needs to be intervention. And as the previous speakers have stipulated, without regulation, without any sort of guiding frameworks, then it's very hard for us as climate change or actually do what we do best. Next steps I'd say regarding this, where we are based currently, is to continue what we're doing, expand our research, and continue seeking partnerships from people who are very skilled, like we met a few today. And let's just hope we get to a point where in the next 5 to 10 years, Lesotho is a country where we're able to say we're proud of the journey we've gone through regarding inclusive design, climate change, and planning cities for people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's great. Great to hear. Oh, clearly some challenges, but also incredible opportunities there. So that's wonderful. I wonder if just very quickly, if you have Valentina there, if she wants to just introduce herself very quickly and say hi. Do you want to do that, Valentina? No? We'll hear from you later, I'm sure. I'm going to move on to the next question. So next question we have is obviously very, very relevant and the forefront of all of our minds, is about what we've learned from the COVID pandemic. So Hannes, I'd like to come to you first with this one. So what have we learned from the COVID pandemic, and how can these insights support future crisis responses? So really thinking about what we've all been through over the past two and a bit years, what we've learned, and how we can take that into our future crisis responses. Hannes, if I can come to you on this first, please.
You're muted, Hannes.
Okay, now, sorry for that. Well, first, of course, I need to recognize that around 90% of the COVID-19 cases occurred in urban areas, where, from my own constituency, blind and partially sighted, face significant, amongst others, face significant discrimination and barriers to access basic services, infrastructure goods, adequate housing, education, etc. during the pandemic, both as a result of, primarily as a result of the precautions taken and measures implemented in their communities. When it comes to transportation and mobility, it has been flagged as one of the most critical issues faced by the WBU constituency during the pandemic, of course. And evidence has actually highlighted how poor urban planning can have serious negative impact on persons with disabilities' lives, as well as the vital role that urban infrastructure has on people's well-being, safety, and access to essential services. It has the pandemic truly shed light on persisting structural inequalities and discrimination, and that there is definitely a long way to go to leave no one behind. And that good urban planning, adherence to accessibility standards, inclusive processes to develop and action pandemic measures would have made significant difference to people's life and resiliency. Truly, we conducted a quite comprehensive survey report to our global membership with nearly 1,000 respondents, and it was clearly pointed out that a way forward, learning from the COVID-19 pandemic, is that there is definitely a lack of compliance with accessibility standards, of localization of the Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities to community levels, and sort of true and authentic usage of inclusive design and universal design principles. I'm thinking of one of the questions which came up in the chat, and it got me thinking of how to bridge with how to think about the role of policies as well. And I think it's about talking about disability inclusive resilient cities. What comes to mind is that we see universal design or inclusive design as making active and conscious design choices for the widest population possible in a community, together as we view green design as optimizing design choices for a greener, healthier planet. And I think the role of policy is to merge this. And I think that is something I personally learned from the pandemic and pandemic response, where we definitely need to step up to really avoid the siloed approach to accessibility or to disability as a social issue, or accessibility is something which is just handled at the planning and building permit department in our municipalities. It requires a holistic and cross-cutting approach. And the absence of such approach in many instances were the ones which created the adverse effects on during the pandemic on the population with disabilities.
Thank you, Hannes. That was great. Really, really clear response to that. So thank you so much. Excellent. Okay, I think I'm going to move on to the next question, because I think this is going to go to all of our panel members, because it's a really important one here. I think, well, they're all important, but given the sub-theme, looking at the participation of persons with disabilities being kind of core to that sub-theme 3 of COSP this year. So the third question, I think I'll come to Rita Metzi first, and then open it up to the rest of the panel. But what are the tools to facilitate participatory planning and design processes to make sure that persons with disabilities are involved in these projects and certainly in climate action. So the tools, so right, Advocacy, if I can, you mentioned this in your last response, if you could maybe embellish a little on some of those tools to facilitate participatory processes, please. I'll come to you first.
Yes, thank you, Ian. Like I mentioned earlier, participatory design is at the heart of what we do. And before we engage with any project or any of our community partners, we first go out to the field on site and we get to consult with them. And basically we have informal interviews, we have participatory mapping. These are exercises in a manual that we've actually developed. And we actually get to engage with the end users of whatever it is would be the end result to find out what are the problems, what are the solutions, and how would they then best be fit to solve them. Once that is done, amongst other activities such as an events and hazards timeline where they map up what are some of the important and critical issues that have happened in a specific time period in that given place and arena. Then we collect the data, we analyze it, and then we present it to the stakeholders and the end users and say, this is what we've gathered based on what you have said in a very holistic and inclusive manner. Once that is done, we then go back to the drawing board, obviously, because we try very much to ensure that this is not a RISE-driven end result, but we make sure the end user and the stakeholders, in this case, for example, government officials, are the ones in the driving seat. And because, as mentioned earlier, this is still a very, I'd say, pretty untapped or not really awakened sector in the country, we're trying by all means to focus on awareness. And that means sensitizing everyone to ensure that they are aware of what this is and what other cities really in Africa as well as across the globe are doing with even less than what we have. On that basis, I'd say the tools are definitely community-centered design, data analysis as usual, and then monitoring and evaluation frameworks. Regulatory frameworks are definitely very important as well. And then I'd say also ensuring that this is done in such a delicate manner that it's able to be sustainable throughout, even without the implementing organization playing a very integral part. I'm sure the other panel members would also find this as a point that sparks discussion of really what is the role or how far should we as implementing bodies be that involved in the process of participatory planning and design around planning for climate resilient cities. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Yeah, great. And I'm going to come now to Michaela. So Michaela, I'd like you to pick up here some of those tools. And I'm also going to ask you if it's okay to kind of bleed into the next question from there. So what are the tools to facilitate participatory planning design processes from your work? And if you could flow that also into the role of inclusive design in creating disability inclusive climate resilient cities, that would be great. Michaela, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ian. So you've kind of started my answer for me, as obviously one of the tools I would say is inclusive design. And I think to answer this, I actually wanted to step back for a second and talk a bit about what inclusive design is, as I think it's a phrase we're mentioning a lot in this session. It's talked about a lot, but sometimes I think people don't always understand, or people have different views about what inclusive design is. So we often find that when people hear about inclusive design, they think about accessibility standards, which might be technical criteria that are being applied to the design of infrastructure or buildings or products or services. And that is a part of inclusive design. It's an extremely important part of it. But inclusive design is also much more. At GDI Hub, we say that inclusive design is a design approach that allows people to experience the world around them in a fair and equal way. So what that's saying is it's an approach or a way of thinking, and it's something that really needs to become part of your everyday thinking, of your organizational culture, in order to create more inclusive environments. This means it's about designing with persons with disabilities and other marginalized groups, or even better, creating the conditions where persons with disabilities can lead in design. So in a project, whether that's an urban planning initiative to improve road networks, or something like a project to regenerate a public space, or to rebuild or adapt someone's home, an inclusive design process has to be a core part of the project throughout its delivery, from funding to procurement, through to writing a brief, developing a design, and the construction itself. So to do that, what we actually need to do is make sure that the built environment industry itself is inclusive, to make sure that people with disabilities can participate fully in the profession. And I think that this can result in designs that create more seamless and intuitive experiences for everybody. These types of designs can also be more durable and adaptable to changing needs and changing circumstances, which is something we need in the fight for climate action. So just to end, I'll talk a little bit about some of the inclusive design tools that we use at GDI Hub that we've proven that work by drawing on the experience of the construction of the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in East London. So the park was built to host the London 2012 Olympic Games, but it's a much wider, much larger development project than that. There's an ongoing legacy to create a new neighbourhood, a new part of London that is as inclusive and accessible as possible. So in order to do that, a couple of the tools that we used that worked well were having an inclusive design strategy, which comes back to the policy question a little bit, an overarching framework that guides how we work and what our aims and mission are in terms of delivering an inclusive part of the city. We also have technical standards that we use to make sure that there's a minimum standard that everybody follows in terms of meeting accessibility requirements. We also have an inclusive design process, and this involves including disabled leaders in the design process through things such as a built environment access panel, which is a panel that was created of local disabled residents who really had an active role in the design process of all kinds of spaces on the Olympic Park. So that includes public spaces, the open green spaces, buildings such as schools, homes. All of these projects were personally and individually vetted by disabled people who live in the community. And that is a really important part of delivering inclusive design. We also worked with inclusive design experts. So it's really important that you have someone who can lead on inclusive design throughout project delivery to make sure there's consistency and accountability in processes. Lastly, it's also about ongoing consultation and ongoing reflection. Buildings change, needs change, circumstances change. We need to make sure that we understand that a design process doesn't end when a building is completed, but that it's a continual process that needs to go on into the future to make sure that buildings are maintained well, that they remain useful and inclusive for everybody in the long term. I'll end there and pass back to Ian.
Thank you so much, Michaela. That was great. Thanks. Lots of tools and things, I think, from both panelists there to kind of for our audience to pick up and think about, if not already. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is really looking at the regional priorities. And we're very lucky with the panel that we have gathered today, that we're working on lots of different projects all around the world. And so I think I'd like to come to perhaps Utsav first, and then Raitametse again, and then perhaps open it up. But what are those regional priorities that we should be looking at in terms of supporting the Global South and areas that we're working? So Utsav, perhaps to you first on this.
Thank you, Ian. Well, really relevant question. I think the Global South at the moment is a major contributor to the global economy at large. I think India specifically is contributing significantly to the global economy. That being said, I think if you talk about India, I think we are talking about scale. We're talking about a seventh of the population, and we are talking about a significant landmass and a very high population density in every city that you go. So the amount of people that are impacted by climate change in India is also significantly high. I mean, if you just take at scale at a community level, in cities like Delhi, in metropolitan cities like Bangalore and all, we are seeing extreme climate events. Like Kanika mentioned about extreme summer that we are currently going through. We just had a horrendous winter by our standards. The erratic monsoons, sea level rise, altered water cycles across cities. There are droughts happening in places which were flooded a couple of years back. So the impact of climate is visible. It's visible everywhere, and we know that it is happening. It is not a phenomena that is happening somewhere else. So we need to tend to it as fast as we can. But speed doesn't necessarily mean progress. So what we also need to focus on is how do we make it more inclusive? How do we think of the last person on the queue that would need as much attention as the first person in the queue, or maybe even higher up? So the problem right now is that we need to, again, going back to the initial question that you had, Ian, was to draft the right kind of policies. Are we making the right kind of commitments to ensure that every person, no matter where you are, no matter what fringe of the society you are part of, you're able to access the benefits of whatever this country is working towards, and without excessively putting onus on the last person on the queue? So the point is that we should have equitable access to resources and be able to make the best out of that. I'll take a pause here. Kanika, would you like to come in and maybe talk about the technicalities of the current work that we have just recently concluded, and maybe even segue into how that can impact the Global South at large in terms of policy and practice?
Yeah, thanks, sir. I would like to add onto a few points that in terms of the regional priorities, we are not only working with a very high density, we are also working with a very high percentage of the informal economy, the unstable income source, which gets disrupted with the impacts of climate change. So there's there's also issues with the food security, there are water shortages which are being faced in all the cities across India. And there are climate-induced disasters which are increasing. The frequency of these disasters are increasing day by day. And because of the disaster, we are having the phenomena of climate displacement. The climate disasters accompanied with the sea level rises is actually making the communities move further inward into the land, and this kind of phenomena is obviously not inclusive. So I would like to say that in the latest study which we have done on the impact of persons with disability of the climate-induced disasters, we can come up with like a few insights: is the lack of disaggregated data, lack of evidence to actually make any sort of policy, or make any sort of policy inclusive for persons with disability. The second thing is unconsideration of the intersectionality which is existing within this group. So, there are different aspirations or different challenges which a woman with disability face, which a child with disability face, or which an older woman with disability face when they have to face with the climate-induced disasters. The third insight was that although we have a lot of policies for climate, they are not they work in silos. So as also has been told by him, that we should not work in silos, but we should have integrated and cross-cutting holistic approach to this entire problem. The next thing is that although India, India and other nations are signatory to a lot of international commitment, but what we need as Global South or a country like India is something which is very contextual to our country. So contextualization of the solution is something which is very much required. And to do that, again, going back to the previous question, is the significance of participation and engagement with the communities, with persons with disability, and the local, local areas. When we talk about all of these things together, it comes down to building the capacities. Building the capacity in a triggering effect, building the capacity, empowering persons with disability in a vulnerable community, to empowering the providers, the service providers, to empowering the city official to actually make those changes for those persons with disability, and then integrating universal accessibility and inclusion as a cross-cutting agenda. So I would like to take a pause here.
Thanks, Kanika. Thank you, and thanks, Utsav. It's really strong points coming through, isn't it? I think so. You know, breaking down silos, you know, the connection there with having integrated policies, I think, is coming through really clearly. As is the need for genuine engagement, you know, which is we all know is so important, and connected to that building capacity. I think so. These points coming through really clear. I think maybe it might be interesting, right, Metsi, Valentina, some of your work in terms of your regional, you know, priorities in terms of some of the project work you've been doing. Is there anything there that you would like to add, or is there any interested in differences in terms of priorities from your point of view?
In terms of priorities, where would I even start? I think, like I mentioned earlier, it's a matter of making sure that everyone is sensitized and is aware that there's a difference between inclusive design and universal design. Let's start there. That was very interesting to realize that until we had the exhibition end of January earlier this year, people had been thinking it's the same thing, and it's not. Our priorities currently is definitely on climate change, making sure that the built environment is gravitating towards more environmentally friendly and climate adaptable buildings. Definitely also ensuring that inclusive design is at the center of all the buildings that we do. We're also trying to definitely ensure that regulatory frameworks are in place with the government officials as well as the private sector that we engage with through awareness campaigns, through workshops, as well as online learning materials that we provide through our monthly webinars, as well as engagement with our new team, as I mentioned earlier, of research and innovation, which seeks to get more materials that aren't readily available currently and resources accessible to everyone in the country. Listening to the other panel members, I think there's definitely some similarities, and then I'd say differences, which would then spark a conversation. I heard earlier the speakers from New Delhi, there is some similarities, but I wouldn't pinpoint specific ones at this moment in time. But we're more than welcome to receive questions once we've gone through all the panel members, for people who'd like to get clarity about what it is we do and how we overcome some of the challenges we're facing in the work that we do here in the Southern African region. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to move, because the next question that we have, and then I'm going to look at some of the, I know we've been answering one or two things in the Q&A box. So thanks again to panel members and the team for answering some of those questions. I guess I'll just reiterate to attendees, if you have a question, do type it into the Q&A. And we'll try and come on to some of those that haven't been answered yet. This is our final kind of question of the session, and I'll come to Hannes and Michaela with this. And it's a bit of it kind of does follow on from priorities, because it's thinking about what next. So for those perhaps not aware, there has been, I think it is fair to say, greater emphasis on this issue over the last few years and even months. On the disproportionate impact that climate has on persons with disabilities. We had the first sessions on this subject at COP26 in November last year. We held a session ourselves there, which was one of the first, which was a bit of a milestone. We also had a similar session that we held at the Global Disability Summit in February earlier this year, and now here we are with this topic as a sub-theme of COSP. So what next? You know, what needs to happen next? And I'm really interested to get the views of all the panel members, but I'd like to come initially to Hannes and then Michaela with this. So Hannes, I'd like to come to you first.
Sure, thank you, Ian. Not sure I will have all the answers, but I want to share a few reflections here. I mean, so what comes next? I mean, first, like when I was reflecting ahead of the session today, I was reflecting that something which I think is critical moving forward is that stakeholders need to recognize that the global frameworks we have at hand, it be the Paris Agreement, the New Urban Agenda, the SDGs, all different types of roadmaps to realize the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in tandem. They work all in tandem. So based on that, and we see their interconnectedness, etc. We see the relevance if localized to the global, from the global to community levels. We also see that many times today, professionals across various disciplines tend to focus only on like one agenda. So often we see that persons who work on climate action with the Paris Agreement don't necessarily work with the new urban agenda. So from my perspective, I see the need that different types of organizations and entities across all levels need to work in tandem and build upon each other's efforts and complement efforts. And we see that across our movement and on different issues, and we see that in the urban development sector as well. And that is, I think that is critical to always be mindful of moving forward, so that we are not ourselves working with the siloed approach. To add to that, I think it's critical moving forward to take a vertical lens about synchronization. It has been continuously mentioned during today's session that there is a lack of, the horizontal integration, that there is definitely a lack across levels and cross department levels, ministries and municipalities, where they put accessibility or disability inclusion as super specific social or building only issues at different departments, but the departments don't interlink. They don't talk with each other, supporting what I mentioned before, that accessibility becomes something very specific and something very siloed, not seen from an inclusive or universal design or whole of society approach. When it comes to the vertical axis, what we have spent also, this relates to regional priorities, is that most of the global frameworks today are undergoing a regional lens and study. Regional development plans are developed. They're translated to guidance for local and national governments, but there's always things to be mindful which can be lost in translation. Here, global and regional organization persons with disabilities can play a key part. And I think from my experience that's also where we can direct priorities for investing in the global movement of organization persons with disabilities to help this synchronization effort, to avoid that things are lost in translation. Moving forward, I think as it was mentioned before today, that one of the most critical events, the premier conference on urbanization, the World Urban Forum, is taking place in Poland in a little bit over 1 week. And this is truly a great opportunity to continue to elaborate on the interlinkage between disability inclusion, climate action, resiliency building through inclusive design approaches. And we are very much looking forward to that. For the World Blind Union at the World Urban Forum, we will launch together with several of our partners a unique publication focusing on public space. But of course, how we progress on making our public spaces more inclusive and accessible is heavily interlinked, and how we make them more sustainable and green and healthy. Next up in the end of the year is the World Congress of the United Cities and Local Governments, who I briefly mentioned in my initial intervention. We are looking forward to, together with our partners again, another organization of persons with disabilities, meet and interact with local and regional governments to support them informing their policies on how to make cities more resilient from an inclusive and disability conscious perspective. So that's what I can share for now. Over to Michaela.
Thanks, Hannes.
Hannes. All right, thank you, Hannes. So I thought I would talk a little bit about three things. So I wanted to mention advocacy, evidence, and action. So as has been discussed so far in the session today, there are numerous policy frameworks that we have to work with here that are a great starting point. We have the international frameworks such as the UN CRPD, the New Urban Agenda. We have national frameworks, including anti-discrimination laws, disability rights laws. We have things like inclusive design standards. These frameworks are a good starting point, but what we're seeing in our research is that there's a challenge around implementation. There's a mismatch from what's been written to what is happening on the ground. And what we want to work on next and continue to work on is how we address that gap. So in terms of advocacy, what can we do? Well, we want to raise awareness of these issues. And I wanted to step briefly back to two commitments that we made as GDI Hub at the Global Disability Summit back in February. So these commitments were firstly, to mobilize resources to ensure that public services are inclusive by actively working towards the aim of removing physical, institutional, and attitudinal barriers. And the second commitment, among many others, is around social protection to include persons with disabilities in climate action. These are two advocacy aims that we have that we need to bring together in order to make sure that we start to address the issue of disability inclusive, climate resilient cities. Then moving on to talking about evidence, which I think can help support and drive our advocacy goals. We're already learning a lot. And as Kanika mentioned, arguably there isn't a need to prove the fact that we need climate resilient design. We know that climate change is happening. We need to be doing things. But what we do need in terms of evidence is evidence that embraces diversity. So we need evidence that considers intersectionality. So making sure that we collect data that is disaggregated, data that considers different types of disabilities. So we don't focus or over-rely on particular types of impairments when we design. And we need to think about local solutions. So we've talked a bit about regional priorities. At GDI Hub, we believe that there are global actions that we should be taking, but we also need to continue to develop evidence that can support local actions. So the last point, action. We need action. We need everybody to be taking action. I saw one of the questions coming through the Q&A was about what the commercial sector can be doing. We need the private sector to also be supporting these aims. And actually the private sector has a huge opportunity to influence the public sector as well. So if everybody is engaged in creating more inclusive environments, more inclusive climate resilient solutions, it will help us to further our goal. But in particular, we want local governments to be taking action. So we need local leadership to embrace the aims of inclusive climate resilience. And we need local governments to enable the participation of people with disabilities in their governance processes to make sure that we then can create the kind of grounds to have more inclusive design happening. Just to end, in terms of what next for GDI Hub, we are continuing to work on our case studies, continuing to develop data on different cities about the current state of inclusive design. And we're always looking for more cities and more partners to engage with. So if you are working in a city where you think there's lots to say about inclusive design and climate resilience, please do get in touch with us because we want to know about it. Equally, if it's not at the city scale, but it's particular projects, please do tell us, let us know about your work, because one of the ways that we're going to create action, drive things forward is by working together and sharing ideas. And one of the reasons for holding events like this event today is to create that forum where we can have a dialogue to create a more inclusive and climate resilient future. I'll end there and pass back to Ian.
That was perfect. Thank you so much, Michaela. That was great. And you've actually, in your response there, I think you've also answered one of the questions in the Q&A about how important the role of political mobilization is when you were talking about the importance of engagement with local governments and local and national governments, and having their motivation and support. So I think that's for Anna Sofia Velasco. I think that's also kind of covered that. Also, thanks to the panel members for answering the Q&A in the Q&A box throughout the session. That's been excellent. So thank you so much. We're out of time. We're at the end of the session. So hopefully you all agree that's been a really fantastic insight across a lot of different work, diverse work on this important subject. It really is just for me now to thank our panels. So I'd like to thank Michaela Patrick, our Senior Inclusive Design Researcher at GDI Hub. I'd like to thank Hannah Zeelan Lagrulis from World Blind Union. I'd like to thank Utsav Chowdhury and Kanika Bansal from India's National Institute of Urban Affairs. And I'd like to thank Retu Metsi Thanko and Valentina Reverso from RISE. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. If you would like to get in touch to find out more about our work, please get in touch via the website, disabilityinnovation.com, and you can also find us on LinkedIn. Thank you and goodbye.